I'm Amy Walter, and I am back at long last with season 2 of The Odd Years. It's a big election year, as you might know, and we know that you have lots of questions for the team at the Cook Political Report. We're here for you. That's why we are opening our new season with Listener Mailbag. Don't worry, if you're looking for the Odd Years interviews, we'll be doing that too. There will be some great new conversations for you very soon, so keep an eye out for those right here at this very place. In the meantime, you can ask us a question about 2024. You do that by going to cookpoliticalreport.com/mailbag or call us at 202-738-8520 and press 8. Don't forget to say your name and where you are calling from. We're going to start off with some good questions here about the current political playing field. We've got Mark from Hershey, Pennsylvania, who writes to us, does Virginia, New Mexico, or Colorado have the possibility to be in play for Trump? Is there any other sleeper state that could be competitive? And Joe Reynolds 2020 on Twitter, or otherwise known now as X, writes, I have only 6 swing states, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, maybe North Carolina. Are there any other outliers you think could turn into swing states like Minnesota or Alaska, New Hampshire? All right, Mark and Joe, excellent question. And you are correct. This playing field does seem really, really small. In fact, abnormally small. And if you go back, not just in the 2020 election, or even 2016, but go all the way back to 2008, what you find is that our playing field has been pretty small for quite some time. Ron Brownstein, who's a political analyst for CNN, he writes for The Atlantic, noted this a couple years back, that when you look at the states that have flipped between Democrat and Republican in those 4 elections that I just mentioned, only 10 states have done so. Another way of saying this is, in the last 4 elections, 40 states have voted the exact same way in every one of those elections. Now, for many of us, this feels pretty normal, right? Oh yeah, we have a narrow playing field. There are only a handful of states in play. This is pretty abnormal, actually. There really isn't another time in modern American history where we had so few seats actually be competitive or flip between one side or the other for such a consistent period of time. And I think that's going to continue into the 2024 election. I like the states Mark picked. Let's look at those: Virginia, New Mexico, and Colorado. Now, Virginia and Colorado, even though they obviously are not positioned near each other on the map, they have a lot more in common than you'd think, not just because I happen to live in Virginia and love Colorado, but because these are 2 states that have a very high percentage of college graduates. And we know that there is a very direct relationship between the amount of education that a person has and the likelihood that that person is going to vote Democrat or Republican. So a state like Colorado that has a very high percentage of people with 4-year college degrees or higher is voting much more Democratic than a state that has a lower percentage. So Virginia, and this is especially true in the Northern Virginia suburbs, which have some of the highest rates of graduate and undergraduate degree holders, those states become bluer. And I think Colorado is probably even a little bluer than a Virginia. New Mexico, for years, New Mexico was actually a real swingy state. And by its makeup and demographics, you can understand why it's a very rural place, obviously. There's significant Mexican and Hispanic population. And beyond being rural, it's an extraction state, a lot of oil and gas that comes from New Mexico. So on its face, you'd say, well, this should be more competitive. But once again, I think you take the combination of the urban areas in the state, which are bluer now than they were before, and the fact that the population that's Latino in and around the urban areas much more democratic. And that has helped to keep New Mexico in the Democratic column, though it's definitely a state worth watching if we start to see like Latino voters moving off of Democrats and being much more up for grabs. The other states that Joe mentioned, Minnesota, Alaska, New Hampshire, those are also good states to highlight. Again, New Hampshire has been a bellwether, used to be a bellwether in the old days, but the last time it flipped from Democrat, the last time it voted for a Republican was before 2008. Not to say it won't do it again, but this is one of those states like Colorado that has a very high percentage of white college graduates and a very independent streak and more liberal leaning on cultural issues. Minnesota, what keeps that state in the blue is the fact that the Twin Cities really are the not just the population center, but the suburbs around the Twin Cities have become more Democratic leaning, even though the state itself is pretty rural. And once Democratic areas of the state, like the Iron Range, have become more Republican. In essence, the density of a state, basically just how big the rural vote is versus the urban and suburban vote, will tell you a lot about whether those states are actually competitive. Okay, now let's go to one more set of questions. We'll put this in the category of what about those third party candidates? Steve from Alexandria writes, what are we to make of RFK Jr.'s support? My prior was that he'd pull more from Donald Trump than from Joe Biden, but current polling seems to suggest that he's pulling about equally from both, perhaps a little more from Biden, if anything. And Karen from Alexandria, don't know, are they neighbors? Are they together? Unclear. There are a lot of people in Alexandria. Maybe they don't even know each other. But anyway, she writes, what's the breakdown whether third party candidates help or hurt Trump or Biden more? And she says, of course, we don't know who the no labels candidates are yet. All right, Steve and Karen, let's dig into this for a minute. If you look at the polling out there right now that tests Trump versus Biden and then names some of the potential third party candidates, like RFK Jr. or Jill Stein, who will be the Green Party candidate, Cornel West, who's running as an independent, what you find is in every one of those cases, Donald Trump leads in the national contest. So it seems as if, as Steve said, his prior that he would pull more from Donald Trump than Joe Biden isn't holding, right? In other words, the vote, while those third party candidates are pulling some vote from Trump, they're pulling more from Biden. And it actually makes some sense if you think about it this way, why these third party candidates hurt Biden more than they hurt Trump. And that is that when you think about who's voting for Joe Biden or why they're voting for Joe Biden, these voters are not necessarily pro Biden as much as they are anti Trump. In fact, the last NBC poll of this presidential race, which was taken back in late January, early February, found that just about 35-ish% of Biden voters say they are voting for Biden because they like him, while the other 60-ish% say they're voting for Biden because they don't like Trump. For Trump, it's actually reversed. You've got close to 60% saying, I'm voting for Donald Trump because I like Donald Trump. And the other group of voters saying, a much smaller group of voters saying, yeah, well, I'm voting for Trump, but that's mainly because I don't like Biden. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you have a coalition, as Biden does, that's essentially an anti Trump coalition, they're not really as dedicated to you as a candidate as they are dedicated to making sure that they're never going to vote for the other candidate, or their dislike of Trump is what unites them, not their love or support for Biden. And that means those voters could be lured over to another candidate that's not named Trump. So if you go into the race as a voter saying, you know what, the only thing I know is that I can't vote for Donald Trump, well, there are a lot of options for you for Donald Trump voters, most of them are showing up because they like him. They're just not going to be lured away by a third party candidate. But what I think you're going to find over the course of this campaign is that we've got a lot of money now flowing into this race, and it's not just going to the two main candidates. I think you're likely to see third party groups. There actually is already a super PAC supporting RFK Jr., and there are going to be other third party groups. There's a Democratic group that is already forming as well, whose job it is to basically figure out who these potential third party voters are and to either encourage them to vote for that third party candidate because the research shows that it helps the candidate you're working for, or to dissuade them from voting for that third party candidate. If you're the Biden team, you're doing everything you can to make sure that the anti-Trump voters are not pulling the lever for an RFK Jr. And the way they're going to do this, well, they're going to highlight the many ways in which he is affiliated with or aligned with many of the personalities and the perspectives and policies of the MAGA movement. If you are on the side of Donald Trump, you may be going to those disgruntled Biden voters who are also anti-Trump voters and finding a way to encourage them to support an RFK Jr. by, I don't know, highlighting the fact that he's been active in the environmental movement. That's something that could get a lot of traction among younger voters, especially. Or you drive a message to those voters that says, why are you voting for Joe Biden? He hasn't done much for you. The establishment hasn't helped you. Go vote with your heart. Don't vote with the mainstream and the establishment. Support RFK Jr. He, like you, wants to break up the establishment. Something like that. In other words, there's going to be a lot of effort going into these third party candidates that's not going to come directly from the third party candidates. And I think that both of our folks who've written in, Steve and Karen here, are raising this question of a third party candidate because it's pretty clear that this is going to be a very close race between Trump and Biden. And even just a point or two that these third party candidates pull could have a huge difference. So expect a lot of attention on these third party candidates, unlike 2016 when we didn't pay much attention to them at all, and those votes became quite decisive. One final interesting note about third party voters, at least from 2016, what we found, and by we, the people who researched voter files after the 2020 election, so this is Pew Research and Catalyst Research, what they found was that Biden's success in 2020 in many ways came from voters who voted third party in 2016 but voted for him in 2020. Those voters were really critical and remain critical to his success. I really loved those questions. Remember, you can send in those questions anytime you get a hankering. You're just thinking of something right now. It's the middle of the night. You can send it here to us, whether it is through cookpolitical.com/mailbag or through our phone number, 202-738-8520 and pressing 8. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report team. It's our way of sharing the questions we love to ask and the conversations we enjoy having behind the scenes. If you'd like to explore more of what we have to offer, consider subscribing at cookpoliticalreport.com/subscribe Odd Years. Our listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is only available to new subscribers. The Odd Years is produced by Becca Kaufman, Allie Flynn, and Catherine Ham. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.